So this is the one in which I follow up on a very lively comment section in another video of mine about how conservatives shouldn't be triggered by a black elf in the new Lord of the Rings TV show. So if you haven't yet, please hit that like and subscribe, and enjoy the video. So to recap, on September 1st, Amazon Prime released The Rings of Power, which is an adaptation of the appendices of J.R.R. Tolkien's epic fantasy work, The Lord of the Rings. And to the surprise of exactly nobody paying attention to mainstream popular culture for the past 10 or 15 years, reactions from fans were disparate and often quite intense. But in my previous video about this topic, I addressed a single point of controversy coming from a particular subset of fans, and that controversy was about the casting of a particular character, a dark-skinned elf by the name of Arondir. Based on highly vitriolic responses that I personally and others saw on social media, particularly Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, highly vitriolic responses that in turn were covered by mainstream news outlets, it was obvious that this was merely the next salvo of right-wing mass hysteria in the latest conservative culture war that's been waged since 2016. Which of course was when the all-female reboot of Ghostbusters was released. So in my video addressing this, I attempted to make the case that conservatives shouldn't be triggered by the casting of a person or people of color in this adaptation of Tolkien's work. As far as I'm concerned, for the litany of reasons that I provide in the original video, which you should definitely check out if you haven't, this particular controversy is ridiculous. However, if there is one thing a bigot can't stand to be called, it's a bigot. And so naturally, the comment section in my video detonated. Much like Saruman's staff when he was expelled from the Order of Wizards by the newly resurrected Gandalf the White.
Saruman, your staff is broken.
I really do have a way with these Tolkien similes. And because I love spirited discourse and good faith debate, I personally engaged with most, if not all, of these comments. And the subsequent discussions and ongoing controversy motivated me to make this video here. After carefully reviewing the dissenting comments, it seems like they can be sorted into 6 fundamental categories. This show sucks, not all critics care about race, what about Black Panther, what about Wakanda, what about the House of Dragon, and there weren't people of color in Europe. So let's address these categories one at a time. 1. This show sucks. To which I say, okay, nowhere in my previous video did I offer or even hint at an opinion about the quality of this show. And for the record, I personally do not and have never subscribed to the notion of objective art critique. As virtually every professional film or literary critic will tell you, there is very little that can be objectively measured about the quality of a story. So as I explicitly said at the end of my previous video, if you are disinterested in or dislike The Rings of Power, that's perfectly fair. If you personally don't care for the acting, the dialogue, the characterization, the premise, the plot, the score, the set design, or some combination thereof, that is totally fair. But if you're upset that a totally original character has dark skin, you're probably a bigot. 2. Not all critics care about race. To which I say, okay. Nowhere in my previous video did I say or mean to imply that all critics cared about race, that race was the only thing critics cared about, or that all criticisms were race-related. As I did say in that video, and more recently in this one, there are perfectly subjective but legitimate reasons to dislike or be disinterested in The Rings of Power. 3. What about Black Panther? As a reminder, the Black Panther film came out in 2018 as part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It was met with extraordinary acclaim from critics and fans alike. It grossed over $1 billion worldwide, and many people regard it as their favorite MCU movie. But, though Black Panther's cast was predominantly black or person of color, 2 white actors did play prominent roles in the story, Martin Freeman and Andy Serkis. And as we all know, this bit of trivia is very apropos since both of these actors played prominent roles in adaptations of Tolkien's work. Martin Freeman played a young Bilbo in the Hobbit movies, and Andy Serkis played Gollum in the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit movies. And yet, nobody objected to or cared about the casting of these 2 iconic white actors in 2 prominent roles in a predominantly black movie called The Black Panther. And I'm betting you didn't either. Oh, and by the way, for those of you who think that this video and my views are motivated by leftist identity politics and wokeism, I should say that even though the Black Panther was again considered by many to be the best Marvel Cinematic Universe film, it's not even in my top 5. 4. What about Wakanda? You see, once bigots, critics, would offer their Black Panther whataboutism and it was shot down, then they would refine it and send it back as, what about Wakanda? Wakanda, of course, being the primary setting of the Black Panther comics and the film adaptation. And to the question, what if there were white people in Wakanda, I have 2 answers. The first and short answer is, I couldn't care less if there were white Wakandan citizens. The second and longer answer is, Wakanda and Middle-earth really aren't analogous. You see, Wakanda is explicitly and consistently conceived as a fictional nation in real-world Africa, and is therefore subject to at least a loose adherence to real-world historic migration patterns and genetic variants. But more importantly, it's consistently and explicitly depicted as an extremely isolationist nation which hoards and protects its natural resources and advanced technologies from the outside world. And that fact is vital to the characters, the premise, the plot, the setting, and the world building of the Black Panther. Whereas in stark contrast, the closest you'll come to the Lord of the Rings source material acknowledging the existence of the real world is a throwaway line from Tolkien about the old world in the prologue before the story even begins. But that said, perhaps a future writer will adapt Wakanda differently, wherein under Prince T'Challa or someone else, Wakanda will loosen its naturalization and immigration policies and let outsiders settle among and reproduce with native Wakandans, thus creating a more ethnically diverse population. Now, I personally wouldn't care, but I understand why some fans would, because of course, Wakanda and Middle-earth really aren't analogous, and we should stop pretending that they are. 5. What about House of the Dragon? Now, this particular type of comment was more than a bit disorienting because it was made by people who were suggesting if folks were being truly bigoted about the Rings of Power, why then they would also be bigoted about the new Game of Thrones prequel, House of the Dragon. To which I say, they were. 6. There weren't people of color in Europe. Now, this particular category of comment is appealing to the fact that Tolkien had conceived the Lord of the Rings as being some sort of prehistory of ancient Europe, albeit again with nowhere near the explicitness or consistency of how Wakanda has been conceived in the Black Panther mythos. To which I say, there in fact were. So, yeah, that basically covers the generic 6 categories of comments that I received on my previous video, which again, you should check out if you haven't yet. And I'll end my response here with 3 rhetorical questions for those of you bigots, critics, who watched that video, who watched this video, and who are still upset about the casting of a black elf in a high fantasy series about talking trees, wizards, orcs, dwarves, sentient evil bling, and whatnot. 3 rhetorical questions. First, how do you feel or what have you said about the long-standing whitewashing of historical non-white figures such as, for example, Jesus Christ? We are talking about a first-century brown-skinned Middle Eastern Jew who was born and lived in Western Asia near the Mediterranean, and yet artistic and cinematic depictions of Jesus have been so white that he'd be the guy at a wedding reception to jump up and demand that the DJ play Cotton Eye Joe. Second, how do you feel or what have you said about the whitewashed casting in movies like Troy? Again, we are talking about a group of pre-Christian brown-skinned people from the Mediterranean being portrayed by Sean Bean, Brian Cox, Brad Pitt, and Orlando Bloom. And third, how do you feel or what have you said about the casting of the upcoming live adaptation of The Little Mermaid? That trailer just dropped a couple of days ago, and reactions on social media from bigots have been wild. And now is probably a really good time to remind everybody that mermaids are not real, and therefore it's okay if one in a movie looks like somebody other than Daryl Hannah. Anyway, those are just some things for you to ponder, and in the meantime, please understand, this video, nor the one that preceded it, are endorsements of the Rings of Power, or recommendations for the Rings of Power, or a defense of the Rings of Power's quality. It is perfectly okay for you to not be interested in or dislike this show. However, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again, if the, or one of the, reasons that you don't like this show is because a POC actor is playing a dark-skinned elf, an original character, a fantasy creature, in a high fantasy setting, with talking trees and wizards and dwarves and orcs and dark lords and flaming eyes and sentient evil bling? A setting which is loosely spawned from 70-year-old books which have in turn been unfaithfully adapted in trilogies of movies that you love? Then, as I said before, you're probably a bigot, and you shouldn't be. Hey you! Yeah, you! Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, and I hope that you did, please be sure to hit the like and subscribe. Also, my link tree is in the description below, so if you have a sec, go ahead and share the love on all my social media accounts. Also, if you want to express an opinion, eternal devotion, or undying contempt, go ahead and leave a comment because we're always looking for feedback. And on that note, I look forward to pondering politics and pop culture again with you very soon.